Good morning. If we haven't had a chance to meet, my name is Nancy Beach, and I serve as one of the teaching pastors here at the church. I couldn't agree more. I encourage you, if you didn't hear Jarrett's message last weekend, please check it out. But are you ready for part 2 on Jonah? Woohoo! Essentially, last week we learned that God has assignments for us. Some of them are big assignments, some are quite little. Jonah got an assignment from God that he chose to run as far away from as he possibly could. And that didn't work out well for him, as we will see. I received an assignment to teach chapter 2 of this book several weeks ago. Jared asked me to do that, and I didn't like that assignment either. I didn't have warm, fuzzy feelings because of my strange relationship to fish. I don't eat fish. I don't like fish. I never have. I know it's good for you. Don't tell me that. But I have never, ever liked the smell. In fact, I made some salmon for my husband this week. I have to plug my nose or it will trigger a gag reflex in me every time. So when I try to imagine a human being inside the belly of a fish with all the smells, liquid, I can't even think about it. It's a huge ick factor. But apparently I must have said yes to this assignment because here I am. Like most people who grew up with this story, and we knew it, by the way, as Jonah and the whale, even though to be clear, the Bible doesn't say it was a whale, I remember thinking of it as a very silly fairy tale. I thought, oh, that naughty Jonah. He doesn't want to obey God and do what he's supposed to do, and look what happened to him. But Eugene Peterson cautions us that this is not a frivolous story. It's one that we should actually take very seriously. This little book can hold up a mirror to all of us if we stop being so judgy towards Jonah and ask, what is here for me to learn? What's here for us to learn? Now, maybe you get sidetracked, I know I have in the past, trying to understand whether this account is factual, whether a man named Jonah actually was inside a fish for 3 days and 3 nights. And Jarrett makes this audacious promise that I'm going to clear it all up for you today. Thank you so much, Jarrett. But I will tell you that I find it interesting and somewhat comforting that Bible scholars do not agree about what kind of a book this is. Some argue, really about half of them, that it's historic and it happened for real. And I think if you believe in a God who can raise Jesus from the dead, you can believe he can do anything, including having a human swallowed by a fish. But the other half of the scholars argue that we should read this book as literature, as a morality tale. It's a story. It's part allegory, part parable, and even part satire. So sorry, it's still a bit of a mystery. But there is a danger, I think, when we focus all our energy on trying to decide what really happened, instead of digging into the profound lessons of this book and seeing what's in it for us. So let's do that. Grab the Bible in front of you if you like, and we're going to explore this together. And here's the question. Here's a little advance notice what we're going to look at today. Do we have to be at the bottom to experience a breakthrough? Whether it's in a human relationship or with God, do you and I have to be at the bottom for anything to break through and to change? You know, Jonah was thrown overboard by the sailors in the volatile waves of the sea. So we're going to start by remembering what happened to him. This is in Jonah chapter 1, if you would turn to that. And you'll find it in the Bibles on page 754. It's just a little tiny book, but so much is here. So the end of verse 1 that we saw last week says, "But the Lord provided a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was inside the fish 3 days and 3 nights." Okay, I just want to pause for a second. The Message translation uses this phrase, "But the Lord assigned a great fish." I love that. God gives assignments to animals as well as humans. He assigned a great fish. So go to chapter 2. From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. He said, "In my distress, I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From the depths of the grave, I called for his help, and he listened to my cry." Sorry, my pages are stuck together. There we go. "You hurled me into the deep, into the very heart of the seas, and the currents swirled around me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I said, I have been banished from your sight. Yet, that little word, yet, I will look again toward your holy temple. The engulfing waters threatened me. The deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. An interesting fashion choice. Seaweed wrapped around his head. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath barred me in forever. But, the little word but, you brought me, my life, up from the pit, O Lord my God. When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. Those who cling to worthless idols forfeit the grace that could be theirs, but I, with a song of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will make good. Salvation comes from the Lord. And the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. Wow. Now here's how I always pictured this story growing up. The sea was wild and crazy until they threw Jonah overboard, and then the sea grew completely calm. So I imagine Jonah kind of treading water for just a few minutes, and then a huge fish comes by and swallows him up. But the prayer Jonah prays in chapter 2 gives us a flashback to what actually happened after his body hit the water. The writer of the story masterfully weaves in this imagery of Jonah going down. He's going down both physically and spiritually. This is what we see. This is from a book by Jared Bias that really helped me understand this little story. Look at how many times he goes down. He goes down to Joppa. That's when he's running away from God. He goes down to get on a boat. He goes down below to the innermost part of the ship. He falls into a deep sleep, which is another way of going down. Then the sailors throw him overboard, and he goes down below the ship into the open waters. He goes down into the very depths, into the very heart of the seas. He goes down to the roots of the mountains, and then he gets shut out of creation and barred into the realm of the dead. In verse 2, Jonah tells us, in my distress, I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From the depths of the grave, I called for help. So what we're seeing here is that Jonah experiences a dramatic journey to the depths, to the underworld. You see, in the ancient world, water represented chaos and death. And Jonah says that the engulfing waters threatened him. His head was wrapped in seaweed, and his descent downward gave Jonah what he thought he wanted. Remember, he's trying to run away from God. Well, he's about as far away as you could possibly be from God. It was a terrifying fall into the realm of the dead. Now, what we see here is that the rescue ride in the fish was not immediate. It only came after this horrific plunge into darkness and despair. Remember that Jonah was one of the prophets. And the pattern throughout the prophets in the Old Testament that we see over and over again, it shows how God's children, the children of Israel, over a period of centuries followed a similar cycle. Here's what it looks like. The people would experience a time of peace and relative comfort. Then they would turn away from God. They would ignore him and forget about him. And then, inevitably, an enemy would attack, or they would be sent into exile and maybe even slavery. They cried out to God, help, help. They turned from their ways, and God sees their repentant hearts, and he restores them, and eventually there's a time of peace again. I want to picture it with you like this and ask you to see where you are in this cycle. Here is a time of comfort. It could be ordinary time. It could be that you're riding high, but you're basically in a peaceful season. Unfortunately, what we can sometimes do when we get in that place is ignore God over time. We begin to actually maybe take credit. Oh, I'm in this peaceful season. Must be something great I'm doing. And we begin to turn and take control and say to God, I don't want to go your way, I want to go my way. And in some area, we stop obeying him. That leads us, eventually, the consequences of those choices lead us to some version of the bottom. We end up in a very low place. And like Jonah, all of a sudden, when we wake up to this, we say, help. We turn back to God. We say that little word, help. God, I need you. I'm sorry, I forgot about you. I need you. And then God hears us, and when we turn from our wicked ways, he says, I'm going to restore you. I'm going to be graceful. I'm going to be merciful. And then eventually, we may return to a season of comfort. Do you see yourself currently in any of these places? Maybe your life is pretty ordinary or actually pretty good right now. You might say you're flourishing. Are you remembering God? Or are you starting to get comfortable with that and actually take the controls back of your life? No doubt in the room today, some people are down here. Some people find themselves at the bottom, and this is where Jonah was. He had to go to the bottom before he remembered God, before he had a breakthrough. Now, how do we get to the bottom? Pastor Tim Mackey says that there's essentially 3 ways that you and I find ourselves at the bottom. Think about a time you've been at the bottom, or if you're at the bottom right now. See which of these 3 is true for you, which of these factors. The first one could be your own doing. You're at the bottom because of your own doing. It's essentially your fault. Let's think of some examples. One that comes to mind is if you've mismanaged your money for a long time, gotten in credit way over your head to the point where maybe you have to declare bankruptcy, you would probably look back and say, I made choices that got me to the bottom. Or maybe you're not taking care of your body. You're not sleeping well, you're not eating well, maybe you have substance abuse, some kind of addiction, and as a result, you begin to have health problems. Those health problems can probably be traced to choices, again, that you have made. So sometimes it's our fault. The second category is the fault of other people. You and I might end up down here because we work for a company that's been mismanaged, and all of a sudden there's a massive layoff, and everybody loses their job, right? That wasn't your doing, but you find yourself unemployed at the bottom. Or you're in a relationship. Think about this one. You've been in a relationship, and I know it goes 2 ways, but let's say that other person, your partner, has been unfaithful. Now you find yourself at the bottom, sad and angry and all the rest, because of the choices of another person. And then the third category is a disaster out of our control, like a natural disaster, a hurricane, a tornado, a fire, a massive car accident, something like that. It's out of your control, but you find yourself down here. Now I have a little quiz for you. Not only what has brought you to the bottom in the past or currently, what do you think, which of those 3 factors brought Jonah to the bottom? Hold up a finger, 1, 2, or 3. Was it 1, 2, or 3? Yes, number 1. Number 1, he made his own mess, right? Because he didn't listen to God. He wouldn't follow what God was asking of him. He didn't accept his assignment, a mess of his own making. Now, most of chapter 2 is kind of a prayer poem that basically the writer plagiarized from the book of Psalms. I'm not kidding. Every single verse is a direct quote from one of the Psalms. And the turning point in the entire story is found in verses 6 and 7. Let's look at that again. To the roots of the mountain I sank what? Down. The earth beneath barred me in forever. But you brought my life what? Up from the pit, O Lord my God. When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, and my prayer rose to your holy temple. When does Jonah remember God? When his life was at the bottom. He's at the very limit. His life is ebbing away. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm a little embarrassed about this pattern when it's true in my life. I would prefer not to require pain and suffering to cause me to turn back to God and obey him. C.S. Lewis sheds light on this in his book, The Problem of Pain. He says, God whispers to us in our pleasures, but he shouts in our pains. It's his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. So is this what God has to do with us? Wake up call. Wake up call. I'm allowing pain and suffering in your life because you don't remember me. Wake up. Wake up. Is that what God has to do? Pain and suffering are a huge wake-up call, but whatever brings us to the bottom, it can be a time for God to get our attention. This was precisely the story for Jonah. Seeing his own frailty, Jonah finally turns to God. He's at the lowest possible moment. And the great fish that comes along is actually an agent of grace and mercy, not judgment. After God hears him cry out, he says, I'm going to provide a way, provide a path for you to come back to me. And he was rescued. So Jonah hits bottom and it leads to a breakthrough. In verse 9, he says, with a song of thanksgiving, I'm going to sacrifice to God. And then the key verse is verse 10 of the whole chapter, because Jonah declares, salvation comes from the Lord. He's finally submitting. He's right-sizing. He has a radical reframing of who he is, right, and who God is. So my question today for you and me is this, once again. Do we have to be at the bottom to experience a breakthrough? That seems like such an immature kind of relationship with God, doesn't it? I mean, what if I could pay close attention to God, walk intimately with him, day by day, moment by moment, regardless of whether I'm in this comfortable place or in a place of pain? Instead of a megaphone to get my attention, what if God could give me one of those gentle sounds like you have when your phone's turned off and you get a little text? Sounds something like this. Yeah, just a little nudge. What if God could do that? God calls us his friends. He calls us his sons and daughters. And if we only think about him when we're in trouble, if we only obey him when we can see that we have no other recourse, it's kind of like college students who call their parents only because they're out of spending money. Not that that's ever happened to me, but you feel used, right? You feel, oh, you didn't really want to talk to me. You just want me to send you a check. When we walk with God, and let's just pause for there a second, that's a beautiful image. When we walk with God through life, we think of him frequently. We try to follow him no matter what life is throwing at us, whether we're cruising along in ordinary time or whether we're experiencing some kind of deep challenge. And we can be responsive to his whispers, just like that quiet little text sound, all throughout our days. It's all about being awake and surrendering to God's control instead of my own, moment by moment throughout my day. In probably, I think it's his first book, or at least it's one of them, John Ortberg's book, The Life You Always Wanted, he tells a really interesting story based on a woman that a friend of his, was visiting regularly in a convalescent hospital. It was a state-run convalescent hospital, not a pleasant place, didn't have enough staff, lots of smells, as you can imagine. And he says, on this particular day, and by the way, this is a long story. Pretend it's bedtime and I'm reading you a story, okay? Hang with me. I think it's worth it. On this particular day, I was walking in a hallway that I had not visited before, looking in vain for a few who were alive enough to receive a flower and a few words of encouragement. This hallway seemed to contain some of the worst cases, strapped onto carts or into wheelchairs and looking completely helpless. Excuse me. As I neared the end of this hallway, I saw an old woman strapped in a wheelchair. Her face was an absolute horror. The empty stare and white pupils of her eyes told me that she was blind. The large hearing aid over one ear told me that she was almost deaf. One side of her face was being eaten by cancer. There was a discolored and running sore covering part of one cheek, and it had pushed her nose to one side, dropped one eye, and distorted her jaw so that what should have been the corner of her mouth was the bottom of her mouth. As a consequence, she drooled constantly. I was told later that when new nurses arrived, the supervisors would send them to feed this woman, thinking that if they could stand this sight, they could stand anything in the building. I also later learned that this woman was 89 years old and that she had been here, bedridden, blind, nearly deaf, and alone for 25 years. This was Mabel. I don't know why I spoke to her. She looked less likely to respond than most of the people I saw in that hallway. But I put a flower in her hand, and I said, "Here is a flower for you. Happy Mother's Day." She held the flower up to her face and tried to smell it, and then she spoke. And much to my surprise, her words, although somewhat garbled because of her deformity, were obviously produced by a clear mind. She said, "Thank you. It's lovely, but can I give it to someone else? I can't see it, you know. I'm blind." I said, "Of course," and I pushed her in her chair back down the hallway to a place where I thought I could find some alert patients. I found one, and I stopped the chair. Mabel held out the flower and said, "Here, this is from Jesus." That was when it began to dawn on me that this was not an ordinary human being. Later, I wheeled her back to her room and learned more about her history. She'd grown up on a small farm that she managed with only her mother until her mother died, and then she ran the farm alone until 1950, when her blindness and sickness sent her to the convalescent hospital. For 25 years, she grew weaker and sicker with constant headaches, backaches, and stomach aches, and then the cancer came too. Her 3 roommates were all human vegetables who screamed occasionally but never talked. Mabel and I became friends over the next few weeks, and I went to see her once or twice a week for the next 3 years. Her first words for me were usually to offer a piece of hard candy from a tissue box near her bed. Some days I would read to her from the Bible, and often when I would pause, she would continue reciting the passage from memory, word for word. It was not many weeks before I turned from a sense that I was being helpful to a sense of wonder, and I would go to her with a pen and paper to write down the things that she would say. During one hectic week of final exams, I was frustrated because my mind was pulled in 10 directions at once with all of the things I had to think about. And the question occurred to me, what does Mabel think about? Hour after hour, day after day, week after week, not even able to know if it's day or night. So I went to her and I asked, "Mabel, what do you think about when you lie here?" And she said, "I think about my Jesus." I sat there and thought for a moment about the difficulty for me of thinking about Jesus for even 5 minutes. And I asked, "What do you think about Jesus?" She replied slowly and deliberately, "I think about how good he's been to me. He's been awfully good to me in my life, you know. I'm one of those kind who's mostly satisfied. Lots of folks wouldn't care much for what I think, but I don't care. I'd rather have Jesus. He's all the world to me." This is not fiction. Incredible as it may seem, a human being really lived like this. I knew her. How could she do it? Seconds ticked and minutes crawled, and so did days and weeks and months and years. Pain without human company and without an explanation of why it was all happening. And she lay there and sang hymns. How could she do it? The answer, I think, is that Mabel had something that you and I don't have much of. She had power. Lying there in that bed, unable to move, unable to see, unable to hear, unable to talk to anyone, she had incredible power. This Mabel was an extraordinary woman. She accessed power and simply walked with Jesus. Her statement just blows me away about how good Jesus had been to her, in spite of everything she was dealing with. And it reminded me of a song that we sing at Soul City. The lyrics are, "All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so, so good. With every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God." Last Sunday, I had the opportunity to teach in a church in LA. I knew I was in Southern California because the name of the church is Beach Point. We don't have any churches named Beach Point in Chicago that I know of. But we sang that song early in the service that I just quoted. And I was standing over to the side observing the first 3 rows of the center section that was filled with about 30 high school students. Now, when I was in high school, we would sit as far in the back as we possibly could. But they had pews in this church, and these kids would show up, some of them a little late, and they'd crawl over each other, so excited to see each other, making room. It looked like there'd never be room for more, and they kept coming, squeezing themselves in, and singing boldly. And then when it was time for me to teach, I looked at their tender faces, their eager faces. They were so quiet, so teachable. And I had one of those moments, one of those assignments from God. It sounded like that little gentle text message. Could we hear that one more time? Yeah, that's what it felt like to me, like God was saying, Nancy, go off script, talk to these kids, talk to these kids. So I looked at them in that moment, and I said, you know that song we sang earlier in the service about God's faithfulness, about how good he's been to us? I said, you know, I've lived at least 4 decades longer than all of you. And I want to tell you, you have a lot of life ahead of you, and I hope you will choose to walk with God, because I want to tell you, he will be faithful. Your life won't necessarily be easy, but if you go his way, if you choose to obey him, and I know obedience is not a popular word. We don't like the idea of obedience because we have to let go of control. But Jesus says, trust and obey. If you trust and obey and walk with me, just like Mabel knew, whether you're way up here or for so many years she was down here, and yet she trusted in God. She believed and reflected back that his grace is never ending, that he's been faithful to her all these years. God, if you're in a low place, might rescue you. He will if you call out to him and say, help. There's nothing you've done that can separate you from his love and grace and mercy. He might just assign a big fish to rescue you. I don't know how he's going to get you back. But if you yield to him, if you say, my life is not for me to control, God. You are my Father. You are my friend. And I choose to trust you. And I want to listen to your nudges and your assignments all day long, whether I'm riding high or very low. I asked Fabi and the team if we could sing that song as we close together today. I hardly ever get through it without choking up because it's just so true. All my life, God's been faithful to me. All my life. He's been so, so good. And with every breath that I'm able, I want to sing. And I'm a terrible singer, but I want to sing of his goodness. So will you stand together, and I want to pray over us, and we're going to sing this song, and I invite you to declare it with energy. No matter what you sound like, it doesn't matter. Boldly declare the goodness of God together. Gracious Father, how incredible it is that we can call you Father. And in this moment, we want to say we're sorry for sometimes ignoring you, for coasting along and forgetting to follow your ways, for ever thinking pridefully that we've got it under control. Help us willingly return to you, even in the good times, God. Help us listen for your gentle nudges and whispers, and remind us over and over that your ways are higher than our ways, that if we trust and obey you, we will know deep, deep joy, and we will taste of your faithfulness. So now we want to sing to you, God, about how good you have been to us, and we're going to do so with energy, and we're going to scroll back, however long we've lived, we'll scroll back and remember your goodness toward us, for which we are deeply grateful. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.